Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Kelly Hamrick. I just wanted to let everyone know that we're just going to wait a few more minutes for additional people to log in, and then we will start this webinar. Thank you. Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar around the release of the 2017 State of Forest Carbon Finance Report. Thank you for tuning in. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. This webinar will be recorded and available on the landing page, where you can also find this report on foresttrends.org. So please feel free to share it with your colleagues if anyone can't make it this morning or this afternoon for some of you across the pond. Secondly, I will begin this webinar by presenting some findings from our report, and then our panelists, who are different project developers and retailers in the market, Julian, Claire, and Christian, will provide insights into their experiences of what they've been seeing for the forest carbon markets in this past year. I also just realized I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Kelly Hamrick. I'm the Senior Associate at Forest Trends Ecosystem Marketplace and the lead author of this year's State of Forest Carbon Finance Report. And then finally, if you have any questions during this webinar, please write them in the question box that you should be seeing on your screen. we should have about 15 to 20 minutes after all the presentations to answer questions at the end of this webinar. So I'm excited to see what you guys are thinking and curious to learn more about. So with that, I'm going to dive into our report. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly recognize our premium sponsors, New Forest, Althelia Ecosphere, and Ecosphere Plus. Our sponsors, Green Trees, BP Target Neutral, Greenwood Resources, our supporter, Good Energies, and special thanks to Baker McKinsey and Wildlife Works. So this report is freely available thanks to the generosity of our sponsors. So for those of you unfamiliar with Ecosystem Marketplace, we are a program of the nonprofit Forest Trends, and we produce reports and articles covering the latest trends in ecosystem markets and conservation finance. Aside from our forest carbon report released today, we also have a newly released report on biodiversity markets, which is actually the first update since 2011. So I would encourage you guys to all check that out if you're interested in that type of market. We also have had recent reports out that looked more closely at voluntary offset buyer trends and regional voluntary market trends. So all of these are shown on this slide here. And if you're interested in learning more, I would encourage you to check out our website, and that's where all of our reports are located. So in our report, The State of Forest Carbon Finance, we take stock of not just the latest offset trends, but also look more broadly at financial flows around forest carbon projects and forest carbon programs. As a result, our report includes what I consider to be 4 distinct categories listed here. So voluntary carbon market activity is where we track transactions of forestry and land use offsets on the global voluntary market. Compliance market activity is where we track policy developments in current and upcoming compliance markets that allow forestry and land use offsets. For 3 compliance markets, we also tracked more detailed information around issuances, transactions, and retirements, where that information was possible. We also track forest carbon project activity. So in both compliance and voluntary markets, project developers can create forest carbon projects and sell offsets to buyers. So in addition to collecting information about those offsets that might have been sold by those projects, we also collected project finance information and information about the non-carbon benefits produced by those projects. Finally, we also track REDD+ program activity. So REDD+ programs are those that occur in developing countries, and they are typically jurisdictional or nationwide and are meant to incentivize those countries into keeping their forests standing. So payments for emissions reductions under these programs are not done on either the voluntary or compliance markets, at least yet. And since the resulting offsets are typically not tradable and don't appear in a marketplace, it sort of is deserving of its own separate category. So we collected most of this data through an online survey responded to by 120 organizations that actively developed forest carbon projects or sold forest carbon offsets in 2016. And then we gathered additional information through desk research. So because there are so many parts to this report, today I am primarily focusing on the data found around voluntary carbon market activity. So more information will be presented from our report in a series of webinars that will be held in December and in January. So next week on Tuesday, we will have another webinar that looks more specifically at REDD+ projects and programs. So if you're interested in learning more, please do tune in then. So from here on out, I wanted to, before I dive into just looking at voluntary markets, make sure we all are on the same page about what is a market and where are they. So this is a bit of a quick trick question for voluntary markets. The global voluntary markets don't have a centralized marketplace where buyers and sellers can easily meet. Instead, most buying and selling occurs through discrete bilateral deals, typically between companies. There are, however, several voluntary markets that are geographically bound and regulated by governments. So last year, we tracked 7 such markets in various stages, including France's Voluntary Carbon Land Certification Initiative, Colombia's Voluntary Carbon Market, and Korea's Forest Carbon Offset Scheme. At the moment, most of these programs are quite small and just target national buyers, but they do exist in several places, and you can see that here as evidenced by the places that are shaded in with pink on this map. You can also see here that there are 13 existing compliance markets in blue and 7 markets that are in development in orange that allow or will allow for forest carbon offsets. In our report, we include brief explanations for each of these. So if you're interested in any particular one, I would recommend that you check out that section. We also provide more in-depth information on 3 compliance markets circled here on the map, and that's Australia, California, and New Zealand. So we will have additional regionally focused webinars on North America, Oceania, and Latin America in January, and I will be following up with announcements about those very shortly. Okay, so here on out, we're focusing only on voluntary carbon markets. So this slide shows a few things, but I want to start with the figure on the right, which shows the offset life cycle. As you can see at the top of the figure, offsets first must be issued before they can be traded. And then after issuances, project developers can then sell their offsets to either brokers, retailers, or end buyers. So the same offset could be traded multiple times before reaching the end buyer and being permanently retired from circulation. So our report tracks these transactions, which means that a single offset could be involved in multiple transactions before being purchased by the end buyer. So please keep that in mind when I'm talking about volume transacted. So overall, since first collecting this data in 2008, Ecosystem Marketplace has tracked nearly $1 billion worth of forest carbon offsets transacted on the voluntary carbon markets. In 2016 specifically, the volume of voluntary carbon offsets transacted contracted 21% to 14.3 million tons from the previous year. Yet the average price paid for forest carbon offsets rose slightly, from $4.9 per ton in 2015 to $5.2 per ton in 2016. Project developers sold the bulk of these. They sold 8.6 million tons at an average price of $5 per ton, while intermediary organizations consisting of retailers and brokers sold another 5.7 million tons at an average price of $5.5 per ton. So this slide takes a closer look at the prices that we tracked. The previous slide showed averages, and this actually shows the volume associated with actual prices. And I think makes the point that actual voluntary prices are highly variable. So we tracked prices that ranged from less than 70 cents per ton to more than $70 per ton, which is a huge spread. So the dark blue on the bars here represents offsets transacted by project developers, while the light blue represents offsets transacted by retailers and brokers. So as you can kind of see here, project developers sold the bulk of their offsets between $3 to $8 per ton, while intermediary organizations typically sold offsets between $1 to $2 per ton or between $9 to $10 per ton. We think it's likely intermediary organizations are targeting 2 distinct types of buyers, the first being those who are interested in purchasing sometimes high volumes of offsets, but are more concerned about the cost. And secondly, those buyers who are interested in supporting offsets from projects that come from specific locations, specific project types, or some other more nuanced attribute. So there are a number of reasons why buyers might pay more for offsets or why sellers might not accept less for them. And we'll touch on a few of these attributes in the next few slides. So this is one of the attributes I just mentioned, project type. So while there are a number of forestry and land use project types out there, we typically only see a handful of project types that are actually transacting offsets every year. So the largest category that we typically see comes from Red Plus offsets, where we track 10.6 million tons. And because this is usually our largest category, we break out this project type into 2 subgroups. The first is avoided planned deforestation, where the project avoids legal deforestation, such as when a concession has been made to convert the land to agriculture. And secondly, is avoided unplanned deforestation, where the project avoids deforestation that might come from illegal logging, fuel wood collection, subsistence agriculture, or other types of issues. As you can see here, there wasn't too much of a difference in terms of either volume or price for these two types of red offset project categories. In the past, we sometimes do see a bit of a difference in terms of the pricing and or the volume, but this year it was quite similar. You can also see here that afforestation, reforestation, and improved forest management projects were the next two largest categories. So these have higher average prices in part because of higher operational costs from the countries they are conducted in. So a lot of these are typically done in either Europe, North America, or Oceania. And so it's typically we see that there's higher operational costs for some of these projects. And finally, I also wanted to point out that this is the first year that we have enough data for urban forestry and grassland, rangeland management offset transactions that we can actually show it on our slide here, which is quite exciting. It's still very small volumes, as you can see, but we did have at least 3 organizations report on transactions for these project types. So then another attribute can be the location of where these offsets are produced. So last year, we tracked forest carbon offsets produced in 45 countries in 2016. Most came from countries with tropical rainforests at risk of deforestation. So a little shy of half, or 42%, of all forestry and land use offsets sold came from projects based in Latin America and the Caribbean, primarily from Peru and Brazil. Africa and Asia also produced high volumes of offsets. 2.9 million tons came from projects in Africa, and 2.4 million tons came from projects in Asia. And these came primarily from countries that include Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Indonesia. And while projects in North America, Europe, and Oceania sold lower volumes, the costs around land, labor, and materials, as I mentioned before, tended to be higher. So we did track higher average prices. So for example, the average price in Oceania was $8.8 per ton. And then this is sort of the last attribute we typically look at, which is the prices and volumes around the standard associated with an offset sold. So over 4/5 of offsets sold were certified by the Verified Carbon Standard, VCS, either by itself, shown by the medium blue in the figure here, or in conjunction with the climate, community, and biodiversity standards, shown in the dark blue here. This large market share can be attributed in part to the number and type of projects that VCS certifies. VCS was the first standard to certify red projects, which are typically quite large. Following VCS, offset certified under the American Carbon Registry made up the next largest share of the market in 2016 by both volume 5% and value 6%. The majority of transacted ACR offsets came from improved forest management and tree planting projects. And the American Carbon Registry typically certifies projects primarily based in the US. The other primarily US-focused standard shown in light pink is the Climate Action Reserve. Both of these had quite high average prices. ACR had $8.9 per ton. The Climate Action Reserve had an average price of $9.5 per ton. Finally, the gold standard, dark green, and Plan Vivo, dark pink or red, typically certify forestry and land use projects in small rural communities in low or middle income countries. The gold standard certified approximately 4% of the market at an average price of $5.7 per ton, while Plan Vivo certified 2% of the market at an average price of $8 per ton. So up until now, I've only spoken about transactions. However, issuances and retirements are also part of the broader market picture. So after a record year of issuances in 2015, the volume of issuances ebbed by 2016 by 26%. However, we don't see this having that much impact on the market as the overall supply of forestry and land use offsets available remains large. Out of the 54.2 million tons issued since 2010, about half, 54%, have been retired, meaning that there's still a number of offsets available for sale and eventual retirement. On the retirement side of things, voluntary end buyers retired 7.9 million tons, which is the second highest volume of offsets ever retired, according to the voluntary carbon offset registries. So the majority, 85% of these were certified by VCS, followed by 6% from Plan Vivo and 5% from the Climate Action Reserve. One final note here before we go on the rest of the presentation is that up until now, our slides have been looking at transactions from both intermediaries and end buyers. But for the next few slides, I will be talking briefly about end buyer demand, which is only focused, of course, on end buyers and not on retailers or brokers. So who are buying voluntary forest carbon offsets? So we don't ask for names in our survey, but we do ask for descriptions. So we can say that most buyers of voluntary forest carbon offsets were concentrated in a few countries, typically the United States, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. Buyers from these countries accounted for 79% of the total volume of offsets sold to end buyers last year. Also typical of these buyers is that they were returning buyers. Only 7% of offsets went to a first-time offset buyer last year. And they were typically for-profit organizations and represented the energy, events and entertainment, finance and insurance, and transportation industries. So everything on this slide shows the market share of these different buyers by offset volume sold. So that's the typical buyer profile, but a big question we always get is why do these buyers purchase offsets? They don't have to, of course. That's why we call it the voluntary market. So what are buyers getting out of this? For most, there is no single answer. They have a multitude of different reasons. However, since we are conducting a survey, we asked the suppliers to respond with what they thought the main reason the buyer purchased their offset. And so those are listed here. The most common reason was to meet GHG targets, greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. So thousands of companies around the world are taking a closer look at their greenhouse gas emissions and setting targets to reduce them in the future. And while some of these reductions can be done in-house, at some point it usually becomes impractical or cost prohibited for these companies to continue to reduce emissions. And that's when they turn to carbon offsets to meet the remainder of their goal. Following that, the next most cited reason was engaging customers or clients. This motivation was lower on our global voluntary carbon market survey, which looked at offsets, not just forestry offsets transacted, but all types of offsets transacted. And I don't think that's particularly surprising that businesses targeting consumers rank this as a higher motivation for purchasing voluntary forest carbon offsets. And that's in part thanks to the many benefits that these projects often have and the compelling stories that they typically include as well. So as I just mentioned, forestry projects typically have a host of beyond carbon benefits that attract buyers. These benefits include contributing to the local economy, protecting key watersheds, or preserving biodiversity habitat. Forest carbon offset end buyers typically said that the presence of co-benefits within these projects had some or major influence over their decision to enter the market. In fact, this co-benefits had some or major influence associated with 92% of offsets sold in 2016. And this is compared to 58% we tracked around all global voluntary offsets, not just forestry offsets. And in particular, as you can see on this slide here, buyers were most interested in community benefits, followed by biodiversity benefits brought about by the project. And also, just as a quick aside, we do provide more details around the impact of forest carbon project co-benefits in our report. So then finally, I'm going to wrap up with a few of our thoughts about what we might be seeing in the future or what we're keeping our eye on at the moment. The first, of course, is the Paris Agreement. As countries are trying to figure out how to implement the Paris Agreement, a lot of them are thinking about how forestry can be a part of their emissions reduction goals. A lot of others are also thinking about trying to include markets in meeting their emissions reduction goals. So there could be a lot of potential for upcoming compliance markets in the future. At the moment, though, it's too early to tell really what's going to happen here. Also, sort of on the same vein, we are also keeping an eye on upcoming or expanding compliance markets. So there are a few carbon markets that have historically said that they might start including RED+ offsets in the future. This includes California and South Korea. And then, of course, there are upcoming markets that might start a lot of new demand for forest carbon offsets, which could possibly include China and also possibly include the upcoming aviation market, which is called CORSIA. CORSIA also could be a large enough source of demand that it deserved its own bullet point on this slide. So the carbon offset reduction scheme for international aviation is going to start in 2021. And right now, it's unclear what offsets will be allowed for airlines to purchase. But if they do allow to include forest carbon offsets, that could be a huge driver of demand in the markets. And then finally, or almost finally, the fourth point, we do expect that there might be an increase in voluntary action, especially in the United States, where we are based. There's been an outpouring of support in the wake of President Trump's decision to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. And we've seen a number of mayors and corporations and civil communities and a lot of different sectors in society say that they want to do more to reduce their own emissions, and they want to set their own voluntary targets that are still sort of in line with what the U.S. was originally promising in the Paris Agreement. So right now, I'm not sure, we don't know how this might relate to offsetting. I think right now a lot of these organizations are just trying to figure out what their targets are. But down the road, certainly, we could see that trickle into more voluntary offsetting as well. And then finally, I just wanted to conclude by mentioning the Sustainable Development Goals. So as I've mentioned in a couple of slides before this, forestry typically has a lot of co-benefits associated with it besides just helping to store or sequester carbon. And so a lot of these co-benefits also align with the Sustainable Development Goals. So it could be that we see a lot more interest along these lines in the future, and perhaps we even might see forest carbon projects trying to sell maybe not just offsets, but other types of sustainable development aligned goals or impacts to interested businesses. So those are just a few of my thoughts on what we might see in the future. But with that, I would then like to turn it over to our panelists. They are, as I mentioned, all active in the forest carbon markets, in the voluntary forest carbon markets. And I always like to hear their perspectives of what they're actually seeing on the ground, because our reports are typically just aggregating all this data we get from all of these different project developers and retailers and brokers. But I think there's real value in hearing what is specifically being seen. So I'm going to, hopefully without any technical difficulties, change over to Julian Eckelhoff, who's the Director of CO2OL Climate Solutions.
All right, thanks, Kelly. I hope you can see my screen and hear myself. If I don't hear anything, I will just assume it's working. Yeah, thanks again for the invitation to the webinar today, and also, of course, for the great work you're always doing with the reports. Always a great read and fantastic source of information for our daily work, of course. I will start with a very brief introduction just to our organization, so everyone who doesn't know us knows our perspective on the market. So we have the brand Cool. Under this brand, we're actually mainly working with corporate clients, organizations on their sustainability strategy, and mainly corporate climate protection issues, including carbon offsets. So this is basically the brand which faces the buyer side. But we are a part of the Forest Finest Consulting company, and Forest Finest Consulting is a service provider for sustainable land use projects. So they also assist project owners, project developers, investors in the development and management of forestry and agroforestry projects, including, of course, carbon projects. So we basically are facing in both directions, both the project side as well as the buyer side, which is always very interesting, obviously, for us, because we try and combine different approaches there. And Forest Finance Consulting, to add this information as well, is a subsidiary of Nature Bank based in Canada. Nature Bank, some of you know also the brand Offsetters from the past. Nature Bank is a specialist for asset management, consulting, and technology, and they are focusing on the management of sustainable commodity production, so also strong carbon as well as project focus. So I will just start with a few thoughts on the different aspects that we heard about today. This is the map of where we are active, and our perspective more or less is especially with reforestation projects. So we are working with gold standard certified reforestation projects, mainly in Latin America, as well as in Ethiopia. So it's from the data that we saw already, actually a rather small niche. Gold standard in the forestry arena doesn't have that much volume yet, but we are sure it will increase, and we are certainly doing our share in that area. And also the reforestation is not the biggest part. So this combination is a very specific niche maybe, but still really interesting, of course. So just again, a few thoughts on the results. So starting with the project perspective, definitely what was described, and I think this isn't new to anyone working with forest carbon projects, is that co-benefits or the additional impacts, we actually don't really like to call them co-benefits, but I think the term is very much common, so I will talk about the co-benefits here. They are just necessary to deliver the carbon offsets in a sustainable way. So it's not just a nice add-on to have because the buyer maybe likes it, but it's really crucial to develop a good project and to have the incentive locally for the project participants to continue the project, because of course there's carbon revenue and this is nice to have. But as we all know, for most project setups, there are also other alternative revenue sources they could use without having a carbon project. So it's really about delivering those additional impacts to ensure that the local participants are actually really behind the project and it's a sustainable project in the long term. Another thing that was also mentioned in the report, as usual, the voluntary market is an important tool or important platform to develop also new project approaches, new project types maybe, to generate innovation in the market. For us, one very important aspect here is not just like a new methodology maybe or a new project type, which is always nice, but I mean, supply and new supply isn't really the problem, but also the scale and the levels on which the project is working. So for one project part, just carbon revenue might be sufficient, but in order to really scale the project, it might be necessary to innovate new revenue streams, to include new project approaches, and to really develop a nice and new project that is taking different perspectives into consideration. And also, again, when we develop the projects, I think what we all see is that we can tell nice stories about projects, but on the ground is where it's really necessary to achieve a high quality, to do good work, to have a sustainable setup in order to be able to really market the project also in the longer term and create sustainable revenue. Because if you just tell a nice story, but you don't put in the work in the project itself, buyers will notice at some point, and of course the project also in itself will not be really sustainable in its operation. Combining that with the market perspective, another thing that is not really new to any of us, I think, is that forest carbon credits, they are not the easiest credit to sell, I would say. Not that any carbon credit is a self-selling product, but I don't think forest carbon credits are what you typically see on a platform where you just transact large volumes of credits at low prices. This is not really the sales channel that we're seeing here, but it's more about really working with the buyer, trying to build a fit between his business model the project, also talking about the local impacts again, not just having a fact sheet with bullet points where you say, well, it's good for water quality and biodiversity, but really working on that topic and demonstrating what are the real impacts. So doing the monitoring work that goes beyond what the carbon certification requires and really focusing on that part as well. I think one thing that, at least in our work, is really present at the moment is the connection to a buyer's value chain or supply chain. So I think this again goes in the direction of not just focusing on carbon revenue in the terms of carbon credit and having them on the general voluntary carbon market, but connecting the broader project to the broader buyer supply chain if possible, the commodities that are produced maybe in a agroforestry project. We will see a few examples in a minute, and building the link here if it's not as much about the local impacts, but really about the value creation for the company, and working with them on selecting and maybe even developing projects that are just a great fit for them. And regarding the pricing, one more thing we would add is that, yes, if you develop a high quality project, of course, the price is higher, but this also goes in the other direction. So if you develop a project that just requires a higher price, it's not enough to just say, well, this is the premium price I'm asking, and that's the cost of developing the project. This may be the case, but you also have to deliver the additional value for the buyer, obviously, because for him, just the fact that it's maybe more expensive to develop the project might not be enough reason to pay a higher price. So you really have to put in the work. Just a bit of information, maybe looking into our business, our average sales price actually is slightly over $8 per credit. So what we see from what we saw from the data, more or less in the range, a little bit higher than the average for a gold standard or for reforestation projects. And we're working both with end buyers and retailers. I would definitely agree that for us also, when we work with end buyers, the prices tend to be a little bit higher, just also because we, of course, put in the work of together with them of telling the story about how they use the offsets. And over the last few years, actually this year, we saw slightly decreasing price per credit as well compared to previous years, but this was more due to the fact that we actually had more larger transactions. Perspectives, small outlook from what we expect in the future, or like which directions also we try to go with the projects. Putting together the project and the market perspective, one element definitely is what I said already, connecting what the project requires and what the preferences of the buyers might be, creates, of course, sustainable projects, but also the business relevance for the buyer. And there I'm especially talking about connecting the forestry carbon project with the value and the supply chain, if possible, of the carbon buyer, because then it's not just an offset. He doesn't just support the project for the sake of offsetting carbon emissions, but because it has actually supply chain relevance for him. And this goes very much to what Kelly just mentioned. The future is not really certain at the moment. So we feel that starting the work with the projects right now, talking about new incentives and new dynamics beyond 2020, where we maybe don't really know what the role of forest carbon markets will look like exactly. So I think it's definitely in the best interest of projects to start thinking about what other options are there than just the carbon revenue. And one thing that we see very much possible is that it's less buying carbon offsets or investing in offset projects, but really the finance and value chains of companies, which will, of course, still affect the carbon sequestration. And we also would always try and track those effects, of course, but maybe it's more a documentation and a tracking maybe comparable to what we see these days with co-benefits. So the carbon sequestration would be an additional benefit of financing projects that have the same effects like today, but the focus is more on the business benefit for the company who's supporting the project. And now just 2 quick examples from our daily work. This is a model I think many people who are active in the carbon and especially the land use based carbon markets know offsetting versus insetting. So in the example of a chocolate producer who produces, as I see now, very dark, almost black chocolate, the typical aim of producing a climate neutral chocolate would be to purchase external carbon credits, for example, from a forestry project. And the insetting approach then would be to turn or to integrate this effect into the value chain. So you actually work on your own supply chain, integrating the positive climate effect into the value chain and insetting the carbon emissions instead of just purchasing offsets. But this works for us in both directions. So if I go back the slide, what we saw now is the company is integrating the project into its value chain. But if we have the project perspective, we think it's just as important for a project developer to think about how can I take the value chain of corporates and integrate that into my climate project. The effect would be very similar. So I start thinking about, is it possible, for example, for a reforestation project to include a component of agroforestry, in this example of cocoa production, to build additional revenue streams, to strengthen the connection to the buyer, to the corporate who's actually supporting and financing my project, to go beyond just the carbon offset transaction. And the specific project example would be a gold standard reforestation project. Actually, our bestseller or our main project in Panama. Not to go into too much detail, the typical keywords are in the description: native tree species, ecologically valuable reforestation, sustainable management, knowledge transfer, employment opportunities, and so on. So just a really sustainable, well-managed gold standard reforestation project. And then on the other hand, the land use consulting team from our company was involved in working with the cocoa project, plant system, high crop quality, sustainable cocoa production, biodiversity, ecosystem restoration, and UTZ certification in 2014. And now the thing about this is that it's actually both the same project. So they work, we are working on the gold standard certification. It's a climate protection project, but in this same area, it's a cocoa production. And it's not just, in addition, it's not like it's a cocoa production. And by the way, we're also doing some carbon credit stuff to finance the project. And it's also not a gold standard project that does some cocoa as well. But it's the same high quality approach in both areas. So it's really a combined approach, not just talking about a carbon offset and not just talking about the sustainable commodity, but a really integrated approach. And we see that this is a really strong position for the project for the future, to move ahead and to be integrated as a carbon offset producing project while being very much applicable for corporate value chains as well, talking about insetting approaches and so on. And then one final example that I would just list here, it's nothing really new, but since you also mentioned, Kelly, the Sustainable Development Goals, and as we know, the gold standard for the global goals is focusing very much on that, to not just have the carbon sequestration and then, as I mentioned earlier, have a fact sheet somewhere with 4 bullet points of the additional impacts, but really working on documenting what are the impacts. So this is the gold standard reforestation project in Ethiopia, the Zodo project developed by the local communities together with World Vision. And they are really doing great work on monitoring the additional impacts, being just as thorough on doing the water monitoring, water quality, the biodiversity impacts, and so on. So we, as the partner who is basically taking the project to the market, we are able to talk in much detail about carbon effects, but also about the different SDGs that this project is supporting, about the different areas where there's positive impact. And this goes in a direction where at some point, if the carbon credit maybe is not anymore the most valuable or the only aspect of the project, it's in a very good position to work with these other SDG impacts and to show what the real impact of the project is, as well as, of course, also here, we see it in the pictures below, for example, working on ecotourism already, so investing part of the carbon revenue into the development of additional revenue sources. And this is actually the only project that currently depends almost entirely on carbon finance. All the other projects we are working with depend a lot on other revenue streams as well. And this was maybe one final comment which surprised us a little bit in the report, that actually 50% of projects, if I remember correctly, currently depend 100% on carbon revenue for financing the project. And as I described in these slides, we really try and take an approach that's slightly different to that and try as early as possible to build additional revenue streams and additional value impacts to go beyond the carbon component in projects. All right, so these are a few thoughts from my side or from our side regarding the connection of the forest carbon component with corporate supply chains, corporate value chains, and how this impacts also the approach and the development of existing or new carbon projects.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Julian. I'm going to switch over now, or perhaps Julian will, to Claire Wigg. She is the CEO of Zero Emission, which is an organization based in Sweden. So, Claire, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, and good afternoon from Sweden. Firstly, thanks again to Kelly for inviting me to participate. We think it's excellent that information about the markets, voluntary offsetting market, is shared through these forums and the reports. So thank you for that. And I can say that forest offsetting is very dear to us at Zero Emission, since it's been our speciality since the beginning. So I'll go relatively quickly through my presentation, which is about our market and activities here in Sweden. And I'll finish with some of the trends that we're seeing at the moment from the buyer's perspective. So today, Zero Emission is a company of 4 people sitting in Stockholm. And the company was established in 2006. That was the year when Al Gore's film, The Inconvenient Truth, was released. And we have a vision which is there in Swedish, planetnytta, which is a bit difficult to translate, but literally means benefit for the planet. And we offer a fairly standard set of services for a retailer of voluntary offsets, though with perhaps a little more emphasis on the communications and business relevance for all of our customers of the offsetting. We've always focused on forest carbon offsets, though we do offer some energy projects as well. So a little bit about Sweden, but a bit of the background first. It's not such a big country, it's ours to work in. So Sweden has already come a long way in tackling greenhouse gas emissions at home, and there's widespread understanding of climate change, and the majority of electricity and heating is renewable. And there are many good government-led initiatives for reducing emissions further. So Sweden has actually seen decoupling of growth from domestic emissions over the past 20 years, as seen in the graph there. So the blue line is GDP and the red line is greenhouse gas emissions. So this all looks very positive. But there is a growing awareness that the caveat to that is that, of course, Swedes enjoy a very high standard of living, and with this goes a high level of consumption. So there's more and more awareness of the significant greenhouse gas emissions embedded in goods that come from all over the world, of course. And this is part of our strategy when talking to potential buyers, to look at that. And then just to note, the last point on this slide is that Swedes are very connected to nature, and there's forest everywhere. which makes forest carbon offsetting very easy to hand for people here. So just moving on to touch briefly on the views of the general public, which we sample every year. Don't worry, I'll translate this. So every year we commission a survey of the general public, and this is one of the questions we ask. The question is, how much do you agree with the statement, carbon offsetting is a good way for companies and organizations to take responsibility for the climate? And so if you look at those who agree, then the total is 60%, those who agree wholeheartedly and those who agree. And this has been rising since we started the survey in 2011, which is good to see. And we see this as an indicator that the market is, people are open to see offsetting in communication materials and in the companies that they buy from. So the response to this question leveled out in 2017, which was not so great to see perhaps, but we think that 60% is relatively high, and we'll see what happens in 2018. Here's a little bit about our customers. So our buyers are businesses in many sectors. They range from SMEs, one-man companies, to international ones. But we have a big focus on food and beverage sector. The ecosystem marketplace reports find that many buyers for offsets come from the energy, transport, tourism and event sectors, and this is not so for us. We sell the majority of our offsets to consumer-facing companies, especially, as I said, in food and beverages. And it's most likely to be for a number of reasons. First, when we began 11 years ago, our first customers were from those sectors. Secondly, we work closely with a sister company, You and We, which also specializes in the food and beverage sectors. And we've had this focus together. And also some of our biggest customers are in the sector, and they've been very successful over a good number of years now in communicating about their offsetting. And so they've raised the profile of voluntary offsetting themselves. And of course, forest offsetting is relatively easy to connect to food production, so focusing on this for food and beverage companies has worked well. But that said, we have banks, IT companies, service companies, industrials, clothing companies, NGOs and others amongst our customers today. And just to note on the last point there, sustainability reporting is now compulsory in Sweden as in other countries in the EU for the largest companies. So there's an extra incentive now for companies to offset, since it's something they can write about in their sustainability reports. So, moving on to the question of why buyers offset voluntarily, and here the answers are very, very similar to those presented in the Ecosystem Marketplace report. So they do it to show climate leadership, or because company owners have a sense of responsibility for the planet. And we find that that second point applies particularly for family companies in our experience. We have a number of those. And the images on the right of this slide, they're examples of how 3 of our customers communicate about their offsetting with logos that they've created. All of the customers use forest offset projects. One's a coffee company, one's a burger chain, and the third is a vehicle inspection company. And when we talk to these companies, they all say they've won business with offsetting, so they've been using it for that. They've engaged customers and employees with the offsetting, and it's helped them drive emission reductions. But what I would say is they don't all see that as the reason at the beginning. I think there's a difference between how companies come into offsetting and then how they experience it after a few years. When they reflect back and they say, oh, what's this brought for us? They then see some of the positive impacts, whereas at the beginning, I think they would do it to engage customers and win business, perhaps. But it's later on that they see it's often as well driven their emission reductions. Just a note there about carbon neutrality at the bottom. It's worth noting that we define carbon neutrality according to PAS 2060 and ISO 14021, which means it's very stringent. So we don't actually use that very much at the moment. But this is something that more and more companies are interested in. Just touching on what's being offset by the forestry offsets. So in the case of a couple of the companies in the food and beverage sector, it's the products from the whole life cycle perspective. And that's so that we're including the whole supply chain from farm to table or farm to shelf for food products. And when it's companies, then typical practice in Sweden has been to offset energy and business travel, and of course to follow the greenhouse gas protocol. And as I said, for carbon neutrality, it's everything in accordance with PAS 2060. So, as I said at the beginning, the large majority of the offsets we sell are from forest and land use projects, and they are almost exclusively from Plan Viva certificates. We've sold about half the Plan Viva certificates that have been sold and retired over the last 11 years. Co-benefits are assumed, as the previous speaker was saying. We don't sell any offsets without talking about co-benefits, which we find with forest projects is very easy to do. And we always look for a link for our customers between the business or the product being offset and the project. And this can be direct, for instance, if a product comes from the same country as the offsetting project, but it can be much less direct. Perhaps a bank doesn't have any obvious, a domestic bank may not have any obvious connections abroad, for instance, but maybe the archipelago outside Stockholm reminds us of the low-lying islands of the Pacific, for instance. So we always find something. Which keeps people engaged in our experience. When it comes to the Plan Viva projects, we're selling all different types of methodologies: tree planting, red land use, restoration of forest, all the ones that are currently approved. So, lastly, come to some of the trends we've been seeing here. I think it's very clear for us that the market has been reinvigorated by all the discussion around the Paris Agreement and the recent data about climate change risks. We, at the moment, get more inquiries than we have ever had before. Secondly, in general, companies are widening the scope of their carbon accounting, and this, of course, opens up for widening the scope of their offsetting. And this, of course, is in line with the increasing scope of reporting to CDP and other frameworks like GRI framework. And then thirdly, amongst our network, we see an increasing level of understanding of the voluntary carbon market, which we think is a really good thing. And we try to support and encourage that by sharing our knowledge, especially obviously about forest offsetting, through blogs and seminars, for instance. Fourthly, we have a discussion more often now than we used to with potential clients about domestic projects that could take place in Sweden. Today, there are no certified carbon offset projects in Sweden, and it would be hard for me to argue that domestic projects would be above and beyond emission reductions activities that would happen anyway. But it's, as mentioned in other ecosystem marketplace reports, it's an ongoing discussion here as well. Fifthly, there wrote that there is a wish for co-benefits to be monitored. Yes, in this case of some of our long-standing customers, they do like to see that co-benefits are being monitored, of course, which they are under the Plan Viva standard, and they're interested to know that they'll even be verified. And this can be done for social ecosystem and biodiversity benefits. But we are not seeing a move away from carbon offsets to the purchase of sustainable development goal outcomes in their own right. Maybe it'll come, but not yet. And lastly, this last 2 points, interest in going further with science-based targets and carbon neutrality. Both these we see as going further. Companies are increasing their ambition. They don't see the point really in just doing a little bit. They want to go all the way and to see where they're going in the long term, because more and more people, especially, I would say, especially the younger generation, are very keen to do what they can to combat climate change. So I'll leave it there, but I would like to mention, Kelly thought it was okay if I mentioned the poll that came out. I hope everybody's seen that. It was a question about tax deductibility, and just to say that is a live issue for us. We're discussing with the government here in Sweden, so any support on that issue would be very much appreciated. Other than that, I'll leave it there and say tack for today and the invitation to participate. I'm very happy to respond to questions after the seminar if there isn't time today, and you're welcome to email me, for instance. But now I hand over, thank you, and I hand over to the next presenter.
Thank you so much, Claire. So next up, and our final presenter is Christian, and I'm sorry, Christian, I might butcher your last name, Vrolik, who's the manager at Natural Capital Partners. And one quick note before Christian starts, is that I know we are running a little over time. So if you can stay on the line, we would appreciate it. And if you have any questions, since we might not have as much time for question and answer, please do just write your questions in the box, and I will make sure everyone receives the questions if we don't have time to get to it within this presentation period. So thank you, and thank you, Christian.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Yeah, I'll keep it short, given that it is at the end of the webinar. So yeah, you'll hear now from a third European presenting, but Natural Capital Partners is a global company. We've been working with clients to deliver positive impacts on the environment and society for more than 20 years. Previously, we were the carbon neutral company, and before that even Future Forests. We work with project developers under any standard and any project type on behalf of our clients to help them deliver those positive impacts. When we're looking at this, the whole question that we're talking about today, I think we can go over again what Julian and Claire already said. I think they highlighted an awful lot of the same issues that I would have highlighted if I had all the time to talk about this. I think there's a couple that I'd like to sort of talk about briefly that we see from our perspective. And yes, they are very similar to what has already been presented. I think the first thing is just to reiterate that there isn't a lack of commitment from the clients. And indeed, if anything, we're sort of seeing increased demand. And that comes from all sorts of sides. Look at the reporting of emissions under the CDP, science-based targets, etc. And this increased demand, I think you can also see from what is reported in the report, of course, the increased volume of actual retired tons. And I think it is important sometimes to look at the retired numbers, because that is what is actually being used by the end clients. That is what actually is being paid by the voluntary market. So I think that's an important aspect there. We're actually at a very high level at the moment of market activity. But okay, so there is no lack of commitment. But then when we're looking at what the client is really looking for, we see all those great things that Julian and Claire also talked about. And I think that we see them, but we see probably two specific things. One is location. And here there is I think, a real emphasis on North American forestry projects. I think that's a very big category. There's a couple of other interesting and different locations that are coming up. We see domestic for the client in the end. A domestic project is always interesting. We see Australia as another project or another country where specific location or as a specific location where people are interested. But there are others, and indeed, as the whole mix of our client, we see a whole mix of different locations that are of interest to them, but particularly those ones that I just mentioned. Then the second project type that people are looking at is those that do deliver some specific sustainable development goal, something specific that the client is interested in. The client might have set itself targets in relation to water, in which case they'll be looking at projects that impact water particularly, or it could be to do with health and they'll be looking at that. It could be to do with numbers of jobs, women's empowerment, etc. All these different sustainable development goals can be a real important feature of a project for a specific client. Of course, it could be specific actions, as Julian was mentioned, in a supply chain of that particular client. We see that a lot. It could be different project types that people are interested in, such as the urban forestry, which is popular, grasslands, which is coming up. They're interesting project types that people are looking at the moment. But then if we're not looking at those very specific and specific drivers, I think unfortunately, we do see that there is a downward pressure on some of these project types, on the volumes, etc. The pressure is coming, of course, from the project types that are not forestry, non-landscape type projects, and we do see that as an issue. And of course, some projects will have to be competing with those, but it is difficult to compete with non-forestry projects in terms of price. But some of the clients are not interested in the high price options and are not interested necessarily in all the co-benefits, and they would be looking for a competitive, a cost-efficient solution. So I think the key things here is that this is not a commodity. We're talking about this as markets and all that, and that is absolutely true. It is not a commodity market. It is a very specific, every single transaction, every single client is unique. Every transaction has to be done in its own right. Everyone has their own reasons to make that transaction. And then I think the final point that I do also want to make is on sort of the uncertainties that have crept in because of Paris, the NDCs, etc. They are a driver on the one hand. The whole Paris commitment is a driver that something is going to happen, but it also brings up some of the uncertainties because of the NDCs. Which part of this forest is going to be claimed by the government in, and name your country, Kenya, say, or India? Who is going to claim this credit? And people are going to be are uncertain about what is happening. They're raising questions. They're asking us those questions, and this is completely understandable because there are very few answers in relation to this. The negotiations are still going on. It isn't reducing demand at the moment, luckily, but certainly there are more questions surrounding the counting, the double counting potential here, which of course we all want to avoid. But overall, again, I would like to say that we do not see a lack of commitment from the clients, and I think that's the important takeaway, and I think that is exactly what the Ecosystem Marketplace report is also showing, and therefore I think we should all be looking at this in a positive manner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. So I think if our panelists don't mind staying on the phone a little, maybe 5 to 10 minutes longer, we might go through a few questions. So I will let my colleague, Melissa Gallant, who also, I forgot to introduce her earlier, she is our new associate at Ecosystem Marketplace. She joined earlier this year and has been invaluable in helping make these reports a reality and come out on time. Kelly, and hi, everybody. So we've got a couple really good questions, and I just wanted to, I guess we can kick it off with this kind of a broad general question. Why isn't there yet a global marketplace? And I'll open this up to any of the panelists who would like to take a stab.
Hi, it's Christian here. I think really that this comes down to the fact that it isn't a commodity. You cannot really compare a ton coming from the Brazilian Amazon to a ton generated here in the UK from a domestic forestry project. You cannot compare that cocoa project in Panama that Julian was presenting, compared to a project that reduces the drainage of a peat swamp in Indonesia. It isn't a commodity.
I can add to that. Completely agree with you, but I would also add that if the question is referring to a kind of global trading platform, we find ourselves doing an awful lot of explanation and sharing of information about projects which our customers need in order to make the business case for offsetting. So I think that's one reason why it's not sort of automized and centralized in that kind of way.
Okay, and maybe I will add one point as well, and this is something that Ecosystem Marketplace in the reports is always focusing, what we talked about briefly. I think the fact that there is not the one global marketplace also can be seen as a positive in terms of there's not the one system that every single project has to fit into. So there's different approaches, as Christian mentioned. There's different concepts, individual projects, a lot of explaining going on, as Claire said. And I think this is actually a strength, that there can be different approaches and not everything has to fit into this one scheme that is globally organized, like, for example, some compliance markets might be.
Thank you. And then we've got a more specific question. This is for Julian, but of course, if anyone else wants to weigh in, then please feel free. Is there a difference between restoration and reforestation projects with regard to the price of the offset and the way that it sequesters carbon dioxide?
Yes, in general, we don't have, I would say that the price per offset depends more on a project by project level than on restoration versus, for example, reforestation or afforestation. So I would say really it depends more on other things. It's not that we could generalize a price difference there. Apart from that, regarding the more technical side, if I understood the question correctly, there are different approaches. Yes, I would say it's more about how you set up the project in general, how you include local stakeholders and so on. Not that much about the actual carbon methodology, the way you calculate the biomass and so on. So I would say it's more about the project setup where the technical difference is than regarding the just the carbon accounting. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Another question too. So Claire, you had mentioned that there was interest in a lot of companies are trying to kind of go above and beyond what they've done before with things like the science-based targets or trying to go carbon neutral. Would you say, and everyone, would you say that this is kind of specific to a small group of leaders in the market, or would you say that this is more widespread and becoming more widespread throughout the market?
Yes, I would say that there's effects at all levels in the market. So those that are ready to set science-based targets and looking seriously at carbon neutral for the whole of the scope of their emissions, those are the ones that are the leaders today. But that's not to say that there isn't the commitment that Christian was talking about. So you begin to see the next set of companies coming into the market. So it's the increasing interest is there at all levels. The ones that are ready to set science-based targets are the leaders today, but we expect in 3-5 years' time that it'll be those who are just beginning to offset today that will get to that level.
Yeah, we also see the interest to be a climate leader from a whole variety of different clients. not just the ones from whom you would expect it. It is also other people, but it is often the climate leaders that are most interested in these types of forest projects, the ones that are the most charismatic, really. So it is climate leadership in many different ways, but at the same time, there are lots of other clients that might be looking at more cost-efficient solutions to this, but they're still going carbon neutral completely. And of course, it is also true that for some companies it is easier to do that than for others. Some industries are much more emission heavy, and it is just a more difficult decision to do that. But we do see plenty of those as well that are taking a real leadership role.
Great to hear. Thank you. So another question for Christian specifically. You had mentioned in your presentation that you were seeing interest in a lot of forestry offsets from the US and Australia. Would you say that those were coming from buyers in those areas or from other countries looking to buy offsets from those countries?
It is mostly related to to clients that have operations in those countries. Yes. So in that sense, it is very similar to of course, the ones that Claire mentioned with people looking for domestic credits in Sweden. It is where people have operations that they want to have an impact, a direct impact, and they like to do that through this type of project. And yes, that is both the ones in North America and Australia as well.
Great, thank you. So that brings us to the end of our Q&A. Of course, if you have other questions, please feel free to reach out. Both Kelly and I would be happy to answer whatever other questions you may have. And just another thank you to our panelists. This has been just a really great discussion. It's great to hear all these different perspectives in the market. So we really appreciate that. And thanks to all the attendees for tuning in. Thank you, everyone. And I'd also like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded, so that will be up on our website shortly.